In this video, I'm going to give a quick rundown of hazard studies within 20th century geography. You had a few readings up on Blackboard. I hope this video kind of calls out key contextual points from those, and so helps you better digest the more detailed materials within those readings. So hazards themselves, or these, as I put it, severe adverse impacts from natural phenomena, they're not something that people just in the 20th century realized were important. These are the kind of things that have been affecting people throughout history and prehistory. These are the kind of events that give rise to organized study, scientific, academic, of human-environment interactions, geography. But it wasn't really until the 1920s that the more recognizable human-environment dynamics, here this mutual relationship, was articulated, was kind of put forth as here it says mutual, as kind of a co-influencing system. It seems maybe naive to say that, but it's an important step over what came before within geography. So this being prior to 1920s era, say the turn of the 20th century, I guess, kind of the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, when the dominant disciplinary framework was called environmental determinism. And this kind of held that the specific characteristics of a landscape, of an area, invariably would influence the groups of people that lived there, and would lead to some people being better than others, basically. It was this kind of thing coincided with late 19th century colonialism, so like UK and India, a lot of European powers in Africa, the US even beginning to kind of look abroad in its frontiers. So Spanish-American War, when the US began colonial administration of the Philippines. And so environmental determinism within geography kind of provided some intellectual basis for those unequal exploitative relationships. But it also wasn't simply a kind of recognizably racist theory. There are also kind of people who studied whites in Appalachia who felt that these groups, these communities, were regressing in their evolution, that they were kind of this, idealized Northern European enlightened groups when they first landed in the U.S. But as soon as they got into these mountain valleys that were hard to traverse, they started regressing and, I don't know, having lower IQ. So this environmental determinism wasn't really, it didn't have as much staying power. And in searching for alternatives, I think it was Harlan Burroughs, this geographer in the 20s, articulated a human ecology, a behavioral approach. And as I say, it kind of might seem naive for us now to think, okay, humans influence their environment as well as the environment influencing us. But this was kind of the big step. That being said, it didn't immediately begin to kind of draw the attention of people who worked in this area. Now, I even assigned the dissertation work of Gilbert White, one of his earlier pieces. Gilbert White wasn't solely, or I don't know, even primarily an academic. He wrote a lot. He thought a lot, but he worked in floodplain administration during the New Deal. This being a time, in the wake of the Great Depression, when the Roosevelt administration created quite a few groups that had funding and backing to really take on a lot of the problems, the issues in America. It's pretty vague. They had a lot of these, and floodplain administration is just one. So prior to Gilbert White, or writing what he did, kind of the situation he faced when trying to ameliorate the bad effects of floods for farmers, was an over-reliance on these things that have come to be known as technological fixes. What does that mean? Things like dams, levees, certain kind of earthworks to try to either decrease the incident of flooding or decrease the severity of flood events when they do occur. And so those technological fixes, they work until they don't. And one of the problems that Gilbert White identified was that when they don't work, because they had been working up to a point, they can lead to much greater losses, because in their presence, rather than in their absence, in their presence, the people who live around rivers do things differently. Flooding, I'll note too, it's one example of how human environment kind of components of these systems are so intertwined. And even more specifically with hazards, how the flood events kind of prior to human settlement or permanent cropping led to a lot of nutrient deposition. So kind of enhances the quality of the soil, makes it very good for farming, based on all these kind of prior events. But then in the kind of continued occurrence of flooding due to changed human land use, they are now a problem that must be dealt with. And the question is, if you deal with floods too well and you don't have that soil enhancement, then when are the kind of adverse effects long-term going to show up? Things like soil depletion. So Gilbert White's work did get a lot of readership, did get a lot of interest and subsequent funding, and his students, people like Burton and Cates, as we see, they continue to write with him. They kind of push that work further, kind of allowing human ecology to really develop as a field. This you might also see termed behavioral approach. The kind of key underlying question here: how do people act in the face of hazards, and how do they make decisions related to those hazards? The focus of this kind of work is on hazards as objects and on the individuals as the decision makers rather than any kind of groups or things. The underlying questions: what options are realistically available? And how can these perceptions of hazards, their likelihood, differ from reality? And that might influence decision making. It's kind of it's an attempt to take things as they are. So kind of empirically surveying what options are available, how do people think about things, and what can they do in kind of balancing or preparing for hazards. This type of work, this school, is very policy focused. So this is long after Gilbert White was working for the government. But you see in the Burton, Cates, and White reading how one of the sections is all about the new advances between the publication of the first edition of that and the second, all the advances of increased communication between scientists and policymakers. So this was a group of people who were very interested in translating their findings through often survey work, kind of going out and asking people what they think, what they do, into policy, like real outcome at scale. So they kind of base their academic work on kind of site-specific studies, talking to people, individuals or households, but through the process of knowledge creation, of writing books or papers or running models, they want to actually make things better and change it. And they, to some extent, had a good run of it. And when I say they had a good run of it, I mean they were able to at least influence the type of policy that came up in terms of disaster relief or planning. But I mean, I think as we know that the problem isn't eliminated, and it's in part because of shortcomings to that approach. And this isn't anything new from about even the 1980s. Other hazards researchers took the field's findings to heart. So here, kind of as the human ecologists looked to the not just any possible decision that could be made in response to flooding, but realistic ones. This group of researchers, the structuralists, recognized that the individual may not be the best or the only unit of analysis here, so that there are broader structures, things like gender, class, ethnicity, culture, you name it, that weigh in and limit the options available to people, and also but do that differently for different groups of people. So it might not be as simple as taking surveys of people and, I don't know, running averages on those groups. The variation might be interesting in and of itself, maybe the extreme cases. But this group's still reluctant to move back to technological fixes. I mean, the problems with that approach already recognized. So in one way, this kind of movement really across scale of analysis, so less focus on the individual, more on the structures at work, allows modeling, maybe allows mapping to be easier at greater scale. So maybe if less precise in goals, I'll allow that. So the question here, it's not what ideas are in every single person's mind, but rather who is affected, in what way, and how can or can't they respond. So the behavioral approach, the human ecologists often use survey instruments to try to gauge people's perceptions and their circumstances, but those tools are maybe trying to be a bit too precise than they can really justify being. How well can we even articulate our own perceptions? How honest are we going to be? How much do we even really care as kind of people affected by a flood about the research project that's going on? And again, since populations can be mapped realistically, we're not speaking about individual households here, it becomes more possible to talk about places themselves as being vulnerable. And for places, we have a host of environmental variables that might be related to risk or vulnerability, such as elevation, slope, surrounding slope, perhaps, land use cover, land cover, but also social variables, those things like gender, class, ethnicity, culture. They might not be easy to map, but they're mappable, as we'll see. And so now, I don't mean to imply that any one of these traditions really replaces the other. They just sprout up and maybe get a little bit more attention. So both of them definitely do exist and to some extent have been absorbed within broader GIS work. And one of the reasons why things can coexist, or dominant theories can coexist, subfields, is because work can be done at a lot of different scales. So these could be small, manageable systems where hazards can be mapped pretty precisely as we see with the contaminants in the Stein paper. And human behavior, on the scale of individuals, can maybe be modeled and influenced. But also, mapping can help for understanding large, sprawling societal problems. So these could be any host of discrete hazards, or something that we didn't really see in any of these readings is the climate change. So it's not that it was completely unknown as a theory in the 1990s, but it still was not the kind of dominant framing, even in something like the Burton, Cates, and White, where their contention is that the environment is indeed becoming more hazardous. The other way that GIS can be important or useful for this work is not necessarily just in the analysis, but also in the communication of findings. So especially with the human ecologists, there was the goal to influence policy. I think the structuralists have this goal too, but a lot of times when they take up the structure as something that's an influence, they're criticizing it. And so, if you're criticizing the structure, it's hard maybe not to criticize the structure without criticizing people who have power within that. So GIS can have an important role not just in analysis, but in visualizing circumstances or alternatives for people who might be able to set policy, make changes.